Chapter 6. You Again. It turned out that getting the Delfinos, at least one of them, on board was the easy part of the morning. Haggling over money and responsibility ended up taking 2 hours. Jax finally came to an agreement with Corey and Steve and headed back down to the lower levels. Corey had been particularly aggressive in negotiating, which seemed to tickle Marshall to no end, watching Jax squirm. For someone who wasn't explicitly needed in the first place, the ebony-skinned woman drove a hard bargain. Jax walked into the angry spacer and walked past the bar. As he did, he waved to Lucas. "Burger?" he said as he moved to one of the booths near the back of the bar. The cybernetically enhanced bartender nodded. Jax dropped into the booth and took his G-phone out of his pocket. He tapped an icon. "Boss?" Rudy answered. "How's the prep going?" Jax asked, as Lucas dropped off a burger and a frosty mug of beer. The burly bartender nodded and walked away. "It's going. I ordered consumables this morning. They'll be dropped off in another hour. Station engineering just left. The reactor is topped off." Jax took a sip of his beer, then said, "Looks like we're down a Delfino. Any chance they'll let you adjust the food order?" He took a bite of the burger. Even though he knew it wasn't beef, he closed his eyes and let a low moan escape his lips. "Oh, what are you doing?" his nav droid friend asked. "You better not be," Jax swallowed. "I'm eating lunch, you perv. Can you change the order?" "I'll see what they say, but don't hold your breath. Oh, you had a visitor." "Yeah?" Jax pressed. He took another bite, careful that time to conceal the moan of pleasure. Lucas had a gift for spicing up the vat meat enough you'd never know it grew on a meter-tall frame, with nutrient sludge pumped into it. "That woman from the aid camp came by." "What aid camp? Oh, from Mariposa? Who?" I don't know. I know she was here, but—" The pause was a bit unsettling. "I can't seem to access that chunk of memory. I don't understand." The droid trailed off, then closed the channel. The screen on Jax's phone lit up, then returned to the home screen. "Well, if it isn't Jackson Caruso," a woman said from behind Jax. He looked up as a vaguely familiar Asian woman slid into the booth opposite him. "Wait, what?" Jax stumbled over his words. "The woman from the relief camp on Mariposa?" "Miss me?" the Asian woman asked, taking his mug of beer and sipping from it. Her jet-black hair was in 2 braids, each draped over a shoulder. Jax regained his composure. "Not even a little." He reached for his mug, but she was faster, moving it out of his reach. "Who are you? What are you doing here? I know you're not an aid worker, by the way. Asked your boss's boss. He had no idea who I was talking about." He extended an arm to encompass the spacer and the station beyond. "And now you show up here." He munched a fry. "How'd you get here?" She winked. "Well, you wouldn't shut up during the flight from Mariposa about your lovely Kelso station." She grinned. "Oversold for sure." She added, "Name's Naomi Himura." Jax took another bite of his burger and grunted. Around a mouthful of vat-grown beef, he said, "We never spoke during the flight, and I don't care what your name is." He pointed at her. "What do you want?" Naomi sighed. "I need work." Lucas appeared before Jax could reply. "Another round, Jax?" He looked at Naomi. "Sorry, I didn't see you come in. Drink?" She held up the rest of Jax's mug. "I'm good," she winked. Jax nodded to the bartender, who returned the nod and departed. He turned to the Japanese-featured NATO relief worker. "Plenty of work to be found on Kelso. I'm sure you'll find something to your liking." He took the last bite of his burger. "I'd put in a good word for you, but, well, I don't know you from Eve." Before she could reply, he continued, "I'm serious. We never spoke during the trip out from Mariposa. You leave a tracker on my ship?" "How gauche, no," she grinned. "Once I was on the relief corps station, it wasn't hard to hack into, what did you call him, my boss's boss, Klein's terminal, and backtrack where he'd been and who he'd paid." Lucas returned with Jax's beer. He reached for the empty plate. Naomi slid it out of his reach, eyeing the untouched fries. Lucas smiled. "I'll bring ketchup." He strode towards the small kitchen area at the back of the space. Jax took a sip of his beer. "Who are you?" Naomi Himura, I already told you, she replied. Not an alias? She shook her head. Okay, and what do you want? Why do you think I'd have a job for you? Lucas swung by the table, leaving a bottle of honest-to-God ketchup. Jax looked at the bottle, then Naomi. He never gives me real ketchup. I'm cuter. She turned the bottle over, and as she thumped her palm on the bottom to dislodge the thick crimson condiment, she said, You seem like you have your shit together. I figured after your performance on Mariposa, you'd probably have something lined up. She popped a ketchup-covered fry in her mouth. Plus, I hacked the station network. You're pretty popular here. She scooped up more fries. Your family are founders. Posh. Jax waved his hand again. What about Kelso Station says posh to you? He downed the rest of his beer and stood. Bye. Crowded ship. When his alarm went off, Jax rolled over to slap the screen of his G-phone and through sleep-crusted eyes, spotted someone sitting in the chair that he would have sworn was covered in discarded clothes. What? He groaned, rolling back over to sit up and rub his eyes. He blinked the sleep away and was face to face with Naomi Himura, the woman who was most definitely not an aid worker, but very possibly was a cat burglar. Hi, she said. She was leaning back in the chair, the picture of relaxation in a forest green jumpsuit. How long has she been sitting there? He wondered. He slipped his hand under the pillow for the stunner he kept there. You have 30 seconds to explain yourself. He withdrew his hand, stunner activated. He leveled it at her casually, a light on the top of the device indicating that it was charged. She held up both hands. I know this is a bit unorthodox, but nothing. You hacked Relief Corps to find out who I was, then followed me here, then broke into my quarters while I was sleeping. I was there for all of that. You don't need to recap it for me. The green-eyed woman, her eyes are freakishly green, Jax realized, said. She sat up straight in the chair. Like I said, I was impressed with what I saw on Mariposa. I think we could make a good team. I've been reading up on you. I know you've got some type of job on Jebediah. Something about... Jax shot her. Mr. Ichiko, I'd like you to meet Corey Lightning and Steve Delfino, Jax said, as the pair arrived at the mechanical bay that housed the Osprey. The well-dressed man bowed. A pleasure to meet you all. He turned to Jax. I am ready when you are, Captain. Jax held his hand out to the lowered boarding ramp. Rudy will show you to your berth. He turned to the other two. Come on, I'll show you to your berths. Sorry, space is limited. You'll have to share. He turned and walked up the ramp, not seeing the look Steve and Corey exchanged. Skip, get the pre-flight started, please. Corey whistled as she exited the stairwell onto the common deck. You haven't changed a thing. She walked over to the sofa, running a finger along the top. The old cracked leather moved under her ebony-fingered touch. She looked over at Jax, smiling. Hi, Skip, she said, tilting her head toward the ceiling. Corey, it's good to see you again, the ship replied. Steve looked around. Kind of a dump. An offended-sounding noise came from the ceiling speakers. Jax grimaced and turned toward the short passage to the crew and guest berths. This way. The hatch to the berth Jax had assigned to Corey and Steve swung open. Here you go. When the two entered, Jax didn't bother to hide his grin when they turned to look at him. Sorry, infiltrators aren't enormous, he winked. I'm sure you'll figure something out. He turned and grabbed the hatch handle. Over his shoulder, he said, We take off in 10. He closed the hatch behind him. He knocked on the door next to Steve and Corey's. Mr. Ichiko, we take off in 10. A muffled reply came through the door. He tapped his earpiece. Baxter, you all set? Roger that. Everything is secure. Jax nodded as he reached the staircase. 10 minutes later, Jax was sitting at his station staring out the wraparound window at the mechanical bay beyond. The heavy doors were open, and yellow strobing lights flashed in the bay. Rudy was in his station. We're cleared for departure. When Jax didn't reply, the droid pressed, You okay, boss? When Jax still said nothing, the droid rolled over to stop behind the pilot's seat. A metal hand reached out and rested on Jax's shoulder. "Boss?" "Huh? Sorry." Jax looked over his shoulder at a small mechanical friend. The rust-red paint that covered most of the droid's body was chipped in places, highlighting the droid's age. "We ready?" The droid tilted forward on his smart material rollerball, the best he could manage a bow. "Yep, all set." As the droid rolled backwards towards his station, he asked, "Gonna be okay having Steve aboard?" He moved a metal hand in a motion to take in the rest of the ship. "And, you know." Jax waved the droid's concerns aside. "It is what it is, I guess. Flings happen. They rarely turn into more." When the droid didn't press on the other issue, Jax reached for the intercom button. "Everyone should sit down. We're about to depart." Outside the transparent steel windows of the flight deck, a heavy freighter passed by the open mech bay. The 5-kilometer-long monster of a ship lumbered past, likely heading for a parking spot a few kilometers from the station, where dock workers in cargo mover suits would ferry the cargo modules into the main space dock. "Big one," Jack said to no one in particular. The moment the aft section of the massive hauler passed the open bay doors, he worked the flight controls to raise the Osprey up off her landing gear and eased the throttle forward. The sublight engines powered up, pushing the nimble infiltrator out of the bay. Several thuds echoed through the ship as the landing gear retracted and locked down, hull panels sliding into place over the gear. On a small display off to the side of his console, Jax saw the mech bay doors sliding closed. "Sending you our exit vector," Rudy announced a moment before one of the screens on Jax's console came to life, showing him their assigned route away from Kelso Station. Jax eased the Osprey away from the station and around another lumbering heavy freighter that was inbound. He looked over his shoulder. "Wormhole generator?" "Charged and ready," Rudy reported. Jax nodded. "Next up, the Mura." He activated the wormhole generator and watched as a rip in the fabric of space-time opened, and the Osprey leapt through. True story. "You shot me, you fucking prick!" Naomi growled from the chair they had tied her to in the engineering space aboard the Osprey. Baxter was standing next to her. "She has a colorful vocabulary." The angry woman looked up at the combat droid. "Fuck off!" She turned back to Jax, her face scrunched in anger. "You shot me! You didn't have to shoot me!" Jax tilted his head. "Well, you seem to have no concept of boundaries. Don't seem to take no for an answer, and somehow knew a lot more about this job than you should." He leaned against the reactor control panel. "Mind explaining?" "I gotta pee," his prisoner retorted. "Then you better talk fast." He grinned. "Long way to Thamura, and you're not getting up until I get answers." "Fine. Untie me. Give me a tablet or your G-phone." Jax nodded to Baxter, who extended a wicked-looking blade from under his forearm. One quick motion freed Jax's unwelcome guest from the chair. Baxter stood back, the blade sliding back into his arm. Jax reached over and picked a data tablet up off the workbench next to the console. He tossed it to Naomi. The moment she caught it, the screen lit up. He seemed to recall that happening on Mariposa, too. As she held the device, Jax could see data scrolling across the screen, the regular user interface gone. Naomi coughed, and that was when Jax noticed glowing blue lines running up her arm. Slowly, more and more blue lines were tracing up her other arm, along her neck, up to her cheeks. A line traced around her left eye. The blue lines pulsed. Occasionally one would fade and another pulse brightly. She looked up from the tablet in her hands. Each finger had a blue line running its length, ending at her fingertip. "Ever hear of the interface program?" She tossed the tablet back to Jax. By the time he caught it, the screen had the familiar user interface. No visible sign of what had just happened. "Never heard of it," Jax admitted. "It was an Imperial," she started. Jax stood bolt upright, interrupting her. "Imperial?" She held up both hands to stop whatever he was going to say. The blue glow had faded completely from them. I'm not an Imperial. At all. Fuck those guys. She grinned, but it was in no way a happy expression. Toward the end of the war, the Emperor wanted to create something to counter the Independent's use of intel droids. She looked up at Baxter. Those things could infiltrate any system they came near. The matte black combat droid didn't move. She held out her right hand, turning it over, the blue glow seeming to turn on and off at will. So, he created interfaces. Jax leaned forward. So, you're a cyborg? He reached out to poke her forearm. She batted his hand away. Her face crinkled. No, not that there's anything wrong with Borgs, but no. It's more tightly coupled than that. She shifted in her seat, clearly not comfortable with the topic. Interfaces needed to be able to pass for, she gritted her teeth, human. 100% unmodded human. The blue tattoo-like patterns on her face lit up. Biological circuitry? Organic storage media? She pointed to the base of her skull, then her midsection. Cool, Baxter said, breaking his ominous silence. Jax looked at his mechanical friend, then turned to Naomi. Okay, so you're some type of Imperial science project. Why are you here? She inhaled. The war ended before the Emperor deployed us. Once he had his empire, he had no use for us. He terminated the project. She looked around. I really do have to pee. Jack sighed. Fine, come on. He turned to leave engineering. He stopped and looked over his shoulder. When they ask, you stowed away. He didn't wait for her response. Tight quarters. When Jax came up the stairs, he found Mr. Ichiko and Corey sitting at the small table near the kitchenette, looking over a tablet while Steve was watching what looked like an episode of Star Trek, The New Adventures. Not one of the better episodes, Jax noticed. Oh, good, you're all here. He made a come-on motion. This is, my, girlfriend, Naomi. Your, Corey started. Girlfriend? Naomi finished, then coughed. Girlfriend, yeah. Hi. We met a few weeks ago. One of those hookup apps. She looked around the room, pantomiming swiping on the screen of her phone. Couldn't get enough of him after that. She nudged him on the side, then spread her hands apart while grinning at Corey. Jax groaned as he closed his eyes and pointed toward the forward bulkhead and the hatch leading to the head. Then he studiously examined something on the ceiling. When the hatch closed behind Naomi, Steve paused the vid. Girlfriend? Couple weeks? Wouldn't that be around when... His face had a red hue, but Jax wasn't sure if it was an angry or embarrassed blush, probably the former. Jax ran a hand through his hair. Yeah. Anyway, she'll make herself useful and won't get in the way. He made sure to not make eye contact with Steve. Ichiko nodded. Mr. Caruso, this is highly irregular. He was trying his best to keep his scowl under control. I hired you and a crew of your choosing. Now you are adding in, he seemed to be testing the word out, girlfriend? Jax tried his best to mask the grimace he was sure he was wearing with something blander. I understand, Mr. Ichiko. It wasn't my intent to surprise you. I assure you, Naomi understands the need for discretion. He glanced at Corey, who was clearly not buying what he was selling. He looked back at his client, who seemed to be thinking it over. Ichiko inhaled. Very well. That will have to be good enough for me, the elder man replied, turning his attention back to the data tablet between him and Corey. He looked at the ebony-skinned woman. Your turn. Corey stared at Jax for another few heartbeats before turning her attention back to whatever game she was playing with Mr. Ichiko. Naomi walked out of the head and took in the room. Jax nodded to her, then tilted his head towards the corridor where the berths were. Come on, honey. The last word was clipped, and he blushed a deep red the moment it left his mouth. She followed him toward his quarters. From the common deck, Corey shouted, Dinner in an hour, lovebirds. Jax groaned and opened the door to his quarters. When Naomi crossed the threshold, she turned. I will not be sleeping with you. When his mouth opened, she raised a finger. Ever. No, that's, he stammered. Her face was set in stone. Ever. She looked around the room, at the single unmade bed. She reached down, picking up a pair of boxer shorts from the edge of the bed, letting them drop to the ground. Ever, she repeated. I had to come up with something. He held his arms out wide. What would you have had me say? Hey, everyone, this is the weird chick that can hack computers just by touching them and learned too much about her job to leave behind, because who the hell knows if she's trustworthy? I mean, that's quite a mouthful. This is my friend Naomi. Probably would have sufficed. Jax exhaled loudly. Yeah, no. Our client is paying us to rob someone. That someone is a criminal organization. Well, noble, still not legal. I didn't want to risk him scrubbing the job, or at least scrubbing the paying me part. Naomi sighed and mumbled something in what might have been Japanese. Jax wasn't sure. Fine, but like I said, no. She pointed to the bed. You can sleep somewhere else. Jax rubbed his face. I'll sleep on the floor. Jax, Skip interrupted. Jax looked at the ceiling. What's up? He glanced at Naomi, who had an eyebrow raised. Sorry, Skip, Naomi, Skip. Pleasure, the SI replied tersely. Jax, we've got company. Who? Imperials. Skip and Naomi said at the same time. Jax looked at her like she'd grown an extra head, then turned his attention back to the ceiling speaker. How? They must have been loitering just outside detection range of the station. We're 30 minutes from Kelso, and they just dropped out of a wormhole 20,000 clicks ahead. They've been nosing around Kelso more and more, Jax explained, to no one in particular, though Naomi assumed it was for her benefit. He exhaled. Okay, stay in contact and follow their instructions. I'll get everyone ready. He opened the hatch and looked over his shoulder. Well, come on, girlfriend. He held up a finger. They won't be able to detect your glowy thing, will they? She scowled and pushed past him, much more forcefully than he expected a woman of 5'4" to be able to. No, they won't.